the iron shackles shattered like glass. November 3rd, 1848, 3 miles outside Charleston, South Carolina, and the sound that split the midnight air defied every law of metallurgy known to man. The patroller's horse reared back as the enslaved man, whose name the records would only mark as Property 47, held up his wrists. Where there should have been unbreakable fetters forged in the finest blacksmith shop in the South, there was nothing but twisted fragments of metal, glinting in the moonlight like broken teeth. The patroller drew his rifle. His hands shook, not from fear of the man standing before him, but from what he was seeing. Those chains had been inspected that very morning. Solid, flawless. The kind of ironwork that made Charleston Smiths legendary across 3 states. Witchcraft, he'd write in his report that night, his handwriting jagged with terror. No Christian force could break iron forged by Isaiah. But what nobody knew was that Isaiah, the master blacksmith whose chains held thousands in bondage, had embedded a secret into every link he'd ever made. A weakness, a fracture point invisible to the naked eye. And for 3 years he'd been teaching selected souls exactly where to strike. 89 people vanished into freedom using his technique. 89 impossible escapes that baffled authorities, terrorized plantation owners, and sent the greatest detective in South Carolina on a manhunt that would end with the most shocking discovery of his career. Because when they finally caught Isaiah and dragged him to the gallows, he did something that should have been impossible. He escaped from a jail cell whose bars he'd forged himself years before, using the same technique, the same hidden weakness. This is the story they tried to bury. The story of a man who weaponized his own guilt, turned his craft into rebellion, and built freedom into the very instruments of oppression. And it starts with a sound nobody could explain, the sound of breaking iron where iron should never break. Isaiah was born into bondage in 1810, but his hands belonged to fire and metal. By age 12, he could assess the carbon content of iron just by watching how it glowed. By 16, plantation owners across South Carolina demanded his work specifically. His chains didn't rust. His shackles didn't wear thin. His iron held. That was the problem. The workshop stood at the edge of the Ravencrest plantation, a low brick building that breathed smoke from dawn until dark. Inside, temperatures reached 2,500 degrees. Isaiah worked shirtless, his torso mapped with burn scars that formed a constellation of his craft. Other enslaved people whispered that he could hear metal speak, that he knew what iron wanted to become. His owner, Thomas Caldwell, a man whose wealth came from cotton and human suffering in equal measure, called Isaiah the most valuable property in Charleston. Caldwell had purchased him for $1,800 in 1835, a fortune, and made that money back within 6 months. Every plantation, every city jail, every ship's hold needed restraints. Isaiah made them all. "Your work is perfection," Caldwell told him one afternoon in 1845, running his fingers along a set of leg irons destined for a slave ship bound for New Orleans. "Not a flaw anywhere. How do you do it?" Isaiah looked up from his anvil, sweat cutting rivers down his face. His eyes held something Caldwell mistook for pride. "I just give the metal what it needs, Master Caldwell. Every piece of iron got its own nature. You just got to listen." What Caldwell didn't know was that Isaiah heard screams in his sleep, the screams of people held by chains his hands had made. By 1845, Isaiah calculated he'd forged restraints for over 3,000 human beings. 3,000 people who wore his guilt around their wrists and ankles. He tried to refuse work once in 1840. Caldwell had him whipped until the flesh on his back split open like overripe fruit. 20 lashes. The scars never fully healed. Isaiah never refused again. But something changed in him that day, watching his own blood pool on the workshop floor. The metal spoke differently after that. It told him secrets, whispered possibilities, showed him how strength could hide weakness, how perfection could conceal rebellion. In December 1845, a woman named Ruth was brought to the plantation. She'd been sold south from Virginia, separated from her children, 2 boys, ages 6 and 8. Isaiah saw her in the field one morning, her hands already bleeding from cotton bolls, her eyes empty of everything except a terrible, quiet rage. That night he stayed late in the workshop. He heated iron until it glowed white-orange, the color of a demon's eye. He folded it, hammered it, folded it again. 12 times he worked the metal, creating layers invisible to inspection but present nonetheless. Then, at a specific point in each link, exactly 7 centimeters from the weld seam, he introduced a microscopic fault, a crystalline weakness in the grain structure itself. To anyone examining the chain, it would appear flawless, stronger than regular iron even. But if you knew the exact spot and applied force at precisely 37 degrees while twisting counterclockwise, the molecular structure would cascade into failure. The chain would shatter. It took him 3 months to perfect the technique. 3 months of failed experiments melted down and reforged. 3 months of testing on scrap metal in the dead of night, measuring angles with tools he'd carved from wood, calculating force, with a precision that would have astounded university mathematicians. By March 1846, Isaiah was ready. Ruth was scheduled for sale in April, destined for a plantation in Mississippi where she'd never see Virginia or her children again. On the night of April 3rd, Isaiah approached her cabin. The moonlight painted everything silver and black. "You want to see your boys again," he whispered through the gap in the door. Her voice came back hard as stone. "Don't mock me with impossible things. Nothing's impossible if you know where metal breaks." He taught her in the darkness, showed her the exact point on the shackles she'd wear on the transport wagon, the precise angle, the twisting motion. "Like you're opening a jar that don't want to open," he explained. "Right there. Count 7 fingerwidths from the lock. Feel for a slight indentation, smaller than a pinhead. That's where you strike." "Why?" she asked. "Why help me? You make chains for them." Isaiah was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3,000 souls. "Because every chain I ever made sits on my conscience like a stone. Because I can't unmake what's already forged, but I can change what I make from here forward. Because your children deserve their mother." Ruth escaped on April 7, 1846. The wagon was 15 miles outside Charleston when her shackles exploded into fragments. The driver reported seeing her vanish into the pine forest, moving like smoke through the trees. Search parties found nothing. The authorities examined the broken chain. Defective iron, they concluded. Isaiah was brought in for questioning. He stood there, face carefully blank, and said, "Sometimes metal has hidden flaws, sir. Ain't no way to see them until they break." They believed him. Why wouldn't they? Isaiah was the master. If he said metal could betray itself, who could argue? But Isaiah knew the truth. The weakness wasn't in the metal. It was built there deliberately, precisely. A rebellion forged in fire. Then everything changed. The plantation bell rang at dawn on June 12, 1846. Isaiah was already awake, pumping the bellows, when he heard the commotion. Voices raised in anger and confusion. Dogs barking with that specific pitch that meant search parties. Caldwell stormed into the workshop, his face purple with rage. 3 more gone, 3 in one night, all wearing chains purchased from you last month. Isaiah's heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained still as iron. "What plantations, Master Caldwell?" "Pinehurst, Oakwood, and the Jennings place." Caldwell grabbed a set of manacles from the wall, studied them with furious intensity. "All your work, all your supposedly perfect chains, all broken in the exact same way, shattered at a point near the weld seam. Explain that to me, boy." Isaiah walked over, took the manacles in his scarred hands, turned them slowly in the light streaming through the window. His mind raced. 3 plantations. That meant the knowledge was spreading. People he'd taught were teaching others. "It's the new iron shipment," Isaiah said slowly, as though the thought was occurring to him for the first time. "That batch from Birmingham. I told you it felt different when I worked it, remember? More brittle. The carbon content ain't right." It was a complete lie. The iron was perfect, but Caldwell didn't know metallurgy, he just knew profit and loss. "You told me no such thing," Caldwell snapped. "I did, sir, back in March. You said to use it anyway because it was already paid for." Isaiah watched Caldwell's memory search itself, doubt creeping across his face. Had Isaiah mentioned something? The blacksmith mentioned so many technical details. "Fine," Caldwell finally said, "but no more Birmingham iron, and every chain you make from now on gets inspected by Porter." "Yes, Master Caldwell." As Caldwell left, Isaiah allowed himself the smallest breath of relief. Then he got back to work, because there were orders to fill, chains to forge, and secrets to hide in metal. Over the next 6 months, Isaiah refined his technique. He learned to make the weakness even less detectable. He developed a system of communication, coded messages passed through trusted intermediaries, a mark on a barn door, a specific arrangement of tools, a song hummed in a particular key. The message was always the same. Count 7 from the lock, strike at sundown's angle, twist like opening a jar. Freedom is built into the iron. By December 1846, the escapes had reached epidemic levels. 17 people in 1 month alone. The Charleston newspapers ran headlines: "Mystery BREAKAGES plague slave holders. Defective CHAINS or devil's work." One editorial demanded an investigation into the sudden weakness afflicting iron restraints across the Lowcountry. A town meeting was called. Isaiah attended, standing in the back with other enslaved people forced to accompany their owners. He listened as red-faced plantation owners shouted theories: sabotage, witchcraft, a conspiracy among blacksmiths to damage the peculiar institution. That's when Isaiah first saw Detective James Harlow. Harlow was different from the local patrollers. He wore a gray suit instead of rough cotton. His eyes moved constantly, cataloging everything. He'd been hired by a coalition of plantation owners to solve the chain mystery plaguing the region. "Gentlemen," Harlow said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through butter, "this is neither witchcraft nor coincidence. This is human intelligence. Someone understands metallurgy well enough to introduce specific flaws. Someone with access to the production process." The room went silent. "And I will find them," Harlow continued. "I will examine every chain, every forge, every blacksmith shop from here to Columbia. This rebellion, and let's call it what it is, will end." Isaiah felt the temperature drop in his chest. This was different. This man was dangerous. If your blood is starting to boil at the idea of a system so brutal that even the man forced to forge its chains had to weaponize his own work just to save his soul, then hit the like button and write in the comments, "Isaiah's iron will never hold." Write it, because every link he broke was an act of war against an institution that treated human beings like property. Write it because his guilt became rebellion, and his rebellion became freedom. January 1847 brought freezing rain and intensified scrutiny. Detective Harlow established headquarters in Charleston, 3 blocks from Caldwell's plantation. He began systematically cataloging every escape, every broken chain, every anomaly. His methodology was terrifyingly precise. He'd collect the fragments of broken restraints, measure the break points, analyze the angle of fracture. He kept journals filled with sketches and notes. Isaiah heard through whispered networks that Harlow had noticed something. Every single break occurred at precisely 7 centimeters from the weld seam. "That's not coincidence," Harlow told a gathered assembly of plantation owners in February. "That's engineering. Someone is teaching people where to strike." But Harlow had a problem. Even knowing where the breaks occurred didn't explain how. The iron appeared sound. Multiple blacksmiths examined Isaiah's work and found nothing wrong. The crystalline structure was invisible even to trained eyes. So Harlow changed tactics. He began tracking people. Specifically, he tracked the escaped. His logic was elegant. If someone was teaching the technique, there had to be a pattern in who learned it, some connection between the escapees. He was right. Isaiah had been selective in whom he taught, not random, not everyone. He chose people with specific qualities, those being sold away from families, those subjected to particularly brutal overseers, those whose eyes carried that dangerous spark of unbroken will. But selection created pattern, and pattern created vulnerability. By March, Harlow had identified it. Every escaped individual had either worked in the fields adjacent to Caldwell's plantation or had been housed temporarily in Charleston's holding pens, which are precisely 70 yards from Caldwell's blacksmith shop. The circle was tightening. Isaiah knew he couldn't stop. Stopping meant abandoning people who were counting on him, but continuing meant certainty of capture. He began preparing for the endgame. Late one night in April, a young man named Samuel appeared at Isaiah's workshop. He was scheduled for transport to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, basically a death sentence. Sugar plantations killed workers through exhaustion within 7 years on average. "I heard you can help," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was 19 years old, his hands shook. Isaiah looked at him for a long time. Then he brought out a set of transport chains he'd been commissioned to make. He showed Samuel the spot, the angle, the technique. "But there's something else you need to know," Isaiah said. "They're close to figuring this out, very close. When you break these chains, run faster than anyone's ever run before, because after you this might all end." "Why are you doing this?" Samuel asked. "You got it better than most, you're skilled, valuable, why risk everything?" Isaiah stared into the forge, watching flames dance across molten metal. "You know what I hear when I work this iron? I hear screaming. Every chain I ever made that held a person, I hear them. Can't sleep most nights. Can't breathe right. So maybe this ain't about being noble. Maybe it's just about trying to quiet the screaming." Samuel escaped on April 23, 1847. His chains broke exactly as designed. He made it to the Edisto River before the dogs caught his scent, but by then he was in water, and water kills scent trails. Authorities found his broken shackles on the riverbank. Harlow himself examined those shackles, spent 6 hours with magnifying instruments, calipers, measurement tools, and finally, he saw it. The microscopic fracture in the crystal structure, invisible to the naked eye but there nonetheless. "This is deliberate," he whispered, and the investigators around him leaned in. "This weakness was forged into the iron, which means whoever made these chains is the same person teaching people how to break them." He stood up, his gray suit dusty from kneeling on the riverbank. "Gentlemen, we're looking for a blacksmith, and given that 90% of these chains come from one workshop, I believe we've found our criminal." The next morning, April 25, 1847, Detective Harlow and 4 armed patrollers arrived at Isaiah's workshop. Isaiah was mid-strike when they entered, his hammer connecting with glowing iron in a shower of sparks. He knew immediately what this was, the way Harlow moved, the way the patrollers fanned out, the weight in the air. "Isaiah," Harlow said, his voice almost respectful, "I need you to stop working and step away from the forge." Isaiah set down his hammer, slowly. His mind calculated possibilities with the same precision he used for metallurgy. Could he fight? No, 4 armed men. Run, they were blocking the only door. "Am I under arrest, sir?" Isaiah asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm bringing you in for questioning regarding the systematic sabotage of iron restraints across South Carolina." They shackled Isaiah with his own chains. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As they led him from the workshop, Isaiah glanced back at his anvil, his forge, his tools. 25 years of work, thousands of chains, 89 escapes. The accounting was complete. They put him in Charleston City Jail, a brick fortress built in 1802. The cell was 8 feet by 10 feet with iron bars that, Isaiah noted with a careful eye, looked familiar, very familiar, because he'd forged them. A contract job from 12 years ago, 1835, when the jail had been renovated. He didn't smile, but something shifted behind his eyes. The trial began on May 15, 1847. The courtroom was packed with plantation owners, curious citizens, and newspapermen from as far away as Richmond. This was the story of the year, the slave blacksmith who'd weaponized his own craft. Harlow presented his evidence methodically. Broken chains from 43 separate escapes, testimony from patrollers who'd witnessed the impossible breaks, measurements showing the identical failure point across dozens of specimens, and finally, the microscopic structural flaw that appeared in chains traced to Isaiah's workshop. This defendant, Harlow said, standing before the jury of 12 white men, didn't just commit sabotage. He committed it perfectly. He created a weakness so subtle that even expert blacksmiths couldn't detect it. He then taught enslaved people exactly where and how to exploit this weakness. The result: 89 successful escapes, 89 pieces of valuable property stolen from their rightful owners through deliberate, calculated deception. Isaiah sat in the defendant's area, not a defendant's chair, since enslaved people couldn't legally stand trial, but rather as property being evaluated for destruction. The legal proceeding wasn't about his guilt. It was about quantifying the damages and determining appropriate disposal. When asked if he wanted to speak, Isaiah stood. The courtroom went silent. "I'm a blacksmith," he said quietly. "I work iron the way my father taught me, the way his father taught him. Metal has its own nature. Sometimes it breaks where you don't expect. That's not sabotage. That's just how iron is." "Are you claiming," Harlow interrupted, "that every single chain that broke, at the exact same point, in the exact same manner, leading to escapes only by people with proximity to your workshop, are you claiming that's coincidence?" Isaiah met his eyes. "I'm claiming metal does what metal does." The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. Their verdict: Isaiah had deliberately sabotaged property worth an estimated $127,000 in today's money. Restitution was impossible. The recommended sentence was execution by hanging, scheduled for June 1, 1847. Thomas Caldwell stood outside the courthouse afterward, talking to reporters. "I treated that boy well," he lied, his voice choked with theatrical emotion. "Gave him a trade, respected his skills, and this is how he repays Christian kindness." Nobody mentioned the scars on Isaiah's back from the whipping in 1840. Nobody mentioned that Isaiah had been purchased like livestock. Isaiah was returned to his cell. May 16th through May 31st, 15 days until execution. He spent the time examining the bars of his cell with a professional eye, running his fingers along the metal, feeling the structure, the joins, the welds. Guards noticed but didn't care. "Let the witch talk to his devil iron," one laughed. The night before his execution, May 31st, 1847, Isaiah barely slept. He waited until the guard rotation changed at 2 a.m., waited until the sounds of the jail settled into that particular silence that comes just before dawn. Then he stood up, walked to the bars, counted 7 centimeters from the weld point on the 3rd bar from the left. His fingers found the spot immediately. Slightly different from his later work, his technique had evolved over 12 years, but the fundamental weakness was there. Because in 1835, Isaiah had just begun to understand what metal could hide. He wrapped his hands around the bar, applied pressure at 37 degrees, twisted counterclockwise. The bar shattered with a sound like a whisper, like a secret finally told. Within 30 seconds, Isaiah had broken through 3 bars, enough space to squeeze through. He moved like smoke through the darkened jail, his years of working in precise conditions making him intimately familiar with spatial geometry. The outer wall was brick, but the window bars were iron. His iron, from 1835, with the same hidden weakness. By the time the guards discovered his empty cell at dawn, Isaiah was 8 miles away, moving through the pine barrens toward the Cooper River. Behind him, the city erupted into chaos. They wanted you to never find this out, never know that resistance was built into the very tools of oppression, never understand that Isaiah turned guilt into rebellion, craft into warfare, and metal into freedom. But now you know. Now the power is in your hands. Hit like and show that you are not afraid. Show that you remember Isaiah's name, because his story is proof that the chains can break. The escape of Isaiah became legendary within hours. "Which blacksmith VANISHES from impossible cell?" screamed the Charleston Mercury. "Devil's work or Negro cunning?" Harlow stood in the empty cell, staring at the shattered bars. He touched them gently, almost reverently. Then he began to laugh, a sound without humor, just recognition of being beaten by a superior intelligence. "He forged these bars 12 years ago," Harlow said to the sheriff. "He built his own escape route 12 years before he needed it." "How could he know he'd need it?" "He didn't, but he knew someone would. So he built the weakness into every piece of iron he could, just in case." Harlow led the search parties himself. For 3 days they combed the lowcountry. Dogs tracked scents that vanished at rivers. Patrollers watched roads and bridges. But Isaiah knew the landscape better than anyone. He'd been listening to escaped people's stories for years, learning the routes, the safe houses, the secret paths. By June 4th, Isaiah was in North Carolina. By June 10th, Virginia. By June 20th, he crossed into Pennsylvania, free territory. In Philadelphia, he made contact with the Underground Railroad through connections he'd cultivated over years. A Quaker family named Harrison took him in, gave him new clothes, a new name. But more importantly, they wanted his knowledge. "This technique," William Harrison said, examining drawings Isaiah had made of the weakness points, "this could save hundreds of lives." Isaiah spent the next 3 months documenting everything. The exact process, the molecular explanation, the measurement techniques, the angles and force calculations. He turned his oral knowledge into written diagrams that could be replicated. By September 1847, Underground Railroad conductors across 6 states had copies of what came to be called Isaiah's Manual. Blacksmiths sympathetic to abolition began forging breakable restraints and replacing real ones during transport. The technique saved an estimated 200 additional people over the next decade. Isaiah became Isaiah Freeman, a free blacksmith in Philadelphia. He opened a small shop on Lombard Street, but now he made tools for liberation. Hidden compartments in wagons, false-bottom trunks for hiding escapees, and regular chains, real chains without weaknesses, because in freedom, chains were just chains again. He never stopped hearing the screaming, though. Even in Pennsylvania, even making tools for liberation instead of bondage, the weight of those first 3,000 chains never fully lifted. In 1852, 5 years after his escape, Isaiah received a letter. It had been passed through several hands before reaching him, and the handwriting was unpracticed but clear. "Mr. Freeman, you don't know me, but you saved my mother. Her name was Ruth. She made it back to Virginia and found us, me and my brother. She told us about you, about what you did. I'm writing to tell you she passed last month peaceful with both her sons beside her. She wanted you to know she died free because you made iron that knew how to break. Thank you, Marcus." Isaiah kept that letter until he died. It was the only thing in his will that wasn't practical, the only item that couldn't be measured by utility or value. The aftermath rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. In Charleston, Detective Harlow became obsessed with the case. He compiled a 300-page report documenting Isaiah's technique, which he titled The Freeman Methodology, a study in metallurgical sabotage. Thomas Caldwell never financially recovered. The revelation that his premier blacksmith had been systematically sabotaging chains destroyed his reputation. Other plantation owners sued him for damages. He sold the plantation in 1851 at a massive loss and died in 1856, bitter and broke. The jail bars Isaiah broke were examined by multiple experts. They confirmed the weakness had been forged in 12 years before the escape. The city replaced every bar Isaiah had made, a project that took 6 months and cost a fortune. But they couldn't replace the fear, the understanding that metal itself had turned against them. Isaiah lived another 27 years. He married in 1850 a woman named Hannah who'd escaped Maryland through the Underground Railroad. They had 3 children. He taught each of them blacksmithing, but he also taught them Isaiah's manual. Just in case, he'd say, the chains come back. In 1862, when the Civil War reached its second year, Isaiah was 52 years old. He volunteered to work with Union forces, teaching them techniques for sabotaging Confederate equipment. There's a Union Army report from 1863 that mentions the colored blacksmith, whose knowledge of metallurgical weak points proved invaluable. He died in 1874, age 64. The obituary in the Philadelphia Tribune was 3 paragraphs long. It mentioned his blacksmith shop, his community contributions, his family. It didn't mention the 89 people who escaped because he learned to weaponize guilt. For a century, Isaiah Freeman was a footnote, a rumor, a folk tale that maybe had some truth. Then in 2003, a materials engineer named Dr. Sharon Wells was researching historical metallurgy. She encountered a reference to deliberately weakened restraints in a Charleston court document from 1847. Curious, she dug deeper, found Harlow's report, found the fragments of chains preserved in a museum storage room. Dr. Wells analyzed those fragments with modern electron microscopy. She found exactly what Isaiah had hidden: a crystalline fault line introduced during the forging process, invisible to period examination but clear under 50,000x magnification. "This is sophisticated materials engineering," she wrote in her dissertation. "This person understood molecular metallurgy better than the academic scientists of his era. He was a genius working in chains, and he turned those chains against themselves." Her research sparked a resurrection. Historians began re-examining the narrative. The 89 escapes were documented. The Underground Railroad manuals were discovered in Quaker archives. Isaiah's story emerged from legend into verified history. But even now, most textbooks don't mention him. Most Civil War museums don't display his work. Isaiah Freeman's story isn't just about the past. It's about how systems of oppression work in every era. They rely on tools. They rely on people to make those tools. And they always assume, that the makers will comply. But what happens when the makers refuse? What happens when the people with specialized knowledge decide to embed sabotage into the system itself? Isaiah didn't fight with weapons. He fought with knowledge, with precision, with the patience to hide rebellion inside craftsmanship so perfect that nobody suspected. For 3 years, he operated in plain sight, forging chains that authorities inspected and approved, never knowing those chains carried their own destruction. Think about modern parallels. Think about the engineers who build surveillance systems, the programmers who code algorithms, the designers who create control mechanisms. Think about the specialized knowledge they hold, the power to build in weaknesses. Isaiah proved that the most dangerous revolutionary isn't the one with a gun. It's the one with technical knowledge and moral conviction. The one who understands systems well enough to break them from within. The one who can make oppression's own tools turn against it.